This special James Bond edition of Popcorn Digest is dedicated to Sir Sean Connery.
Attentively, I will arrest you, drop you off in jail, and take you to the plane in chains. Understand?
Perfectly. After you. I think she has handcuffs. I do hope so.
It's the Popcorn Digest with Gareth and Andy. Popcorn Digest.
Hello and welcome to Popcorn Digest, the podcast about the films you love and some you don't. I'm your host, Gareth Green, and joining me as always is my full-time co-host and part-time maniacal pussy stroker, Andrew Raphael.
I maybe got the wrong Blofeld, but I surely got the right pussy.
And today we're staring down the barrel at Quantum of Solace, another international espionage adventure starring everyone's favourite sex pest, Jimmy Bond. But is Quantum of Solace a rip-roaring ride, or does it get Bond wrong? Find out after the trailer.
The first thing you should know about us is that we have people everywhere.
What the hell is this organization, Bond? How can they be everywhere and we know nothing about them?
This is the world's most precious resource. We need to control as much of it as we can.
Name check, Dominic Green.
He's a person of extreme interest.
We've already begun destabilizing the government.
You know who Green is and you want to put us in bed with him. Yeah, you're right. We should just deal with nice people.
Get in.
All right.
Careful with this one, Mr. Bond. She won't go to bed with you unless you give her something she really wants.
I think someone wants to kill you.
You two do make a charming couple, though. You're both, what's the expression? Damaged goods.
With camera work more incoherent than a Donald Trump speech, Quantum of Solace is as exhausting in its cinematography as it is befuddling in its plot. Aryan poster boy Daniel Craig is back as James Not Blonde in Quantum of Bollocks, a less talky, more shooty and no plotty follow-up to the vastly more successful Casino Royale. So Andy, we're finally back to Bond.
Yeah.
All roads lead to Bond. We have to do a Bond film every season. It's where our interests lie.
It's the contractual obligation.
It is, yeah. So, Andy, you chose this one.
Yeah.
It was originally meant to tie in to the release of No Time to Die.
Yeah. It was very optimistic, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So at the moment we can say it's a tie-in with the release of Billie Eilish's No Time to Die music video, or whatever it is.
Yeah, and the latest Dick tease footage as well. I mean, the whole film will be out by the time it gets released anyway. They've released that many trailers and sneak peeks and stuff. Whenever this film does come out in whatever format, I mean, I really don't know what's going on behind the scenes regarding that. We're seeing a lot of films going to streaming at the moment, but I don't think they will do that with No Time to Die. I think there's too many agreements and things, and I think a lot of the distribution deals, because it's not been distributed by a singular company, I think a lot of them are based on them releasing it theatrically, and also because they filmed quite a lot of the film with IMAX cameras. I imagine there's also a similar deal with IMAX.
Of course, yes.
As well, so it's not as simple as just plonking it on a streaming service. There's too many companies wrapped up in it for them to not release it theatrically.
Yeah, it's not something like, for example, Mulan, where it's all in-house, essentially, in regard to the production company, whereas they can just simply move that as and when they want to and to what platform they release it. They could release it on a Game Boy Advance for all. But there's too much contractual obligation to release it on the cinema. I don't think, even if there was a push to release it on streaming, that they would be contractually able to in that sense. No. Especially, as you mentioned, the IMAX side of things. It would be a shame to miss out on the IMAX experience of this film when they've gone to such lengths to capture it in that regard.
Yeah, especially as I think it looks like it actually might even be the best shot of all the Bond films. So, yeah, it would be a shame to miss out on that, I think. So, we're doing Quantum anyway, because I'm pretty sure for whenever No Time to Die is released in like 2 years' time, for the 60th anniversary people keep joking about at the moment. I mean, they'll may joke, but it may happen. But
yeah, by the time they get round to it, like, we'll be talking about them casting the next Bond, and it'll be like Jacob Tremblay or something like that.
Fuck. Autistic Bond.
Yeah.
I think for whenever we tie in it again for the actual release, there are other Craig films that we can cover. But I thought it'd be good to do Quantum of Solace today because I think out of all the Craig films, it's probably the least talked about.
Yeah. So there's normally a part of the show as well, just before we do provide the context, where we go through what our experience is with these type of films, whether or not it's a film that we've seen before. Anybody that's listened to the show or listened to our previous Bond episodes will know that we are quite large Bond fans. You more so than me, because you've been more entrenched in the Bond lore for much longer than I have. But I would consider myself a Bond fan now, most certainly, firmly. So I think we don't really need to get really into that. But speaking about Quantum of Solace, I think we went to the cinema together to see this film when it was first released. The same as with Casino Royale. And what was your experience of the film back then?
I would say it's probably mixed positive. I think when it came out, I didn't mind it. I quite liked it. I knew it wasn't as good as Casino. And I felt like a lot of people felt that the main issue was in its brevity and its incoherent action. They were the most obvious flaws at the time, and I kind of wished that it would been a little bit longer and a bit more developed, and you could actually see what was going on in the action. Yeah, I mean, those action sequences, it's like they basically just took a load of money, Joker style, and burnt it in front of you because they'd obviously spent a lot of money on all these sequences, but you can't fucking see them.
Yeah, it's very impressionistic action, I would say.
Well, it's a very impressionistic film.
Yeah, and you do get the feeling that there's money being spent on things that you cannot see.
Yeah.
The locations are lavish. The sets are lavish. They look really elaborate and large. And yet, we can't really ever get chance to appreciate what we're actually watching. But that's something we'll get into very shortly, I think. I think my experience with Quantum of Solace, I would say that I was on the far more negative, disappointed side of things when the film was released. But I think it's also because Casino Royale, it had a long shadow for me over this film.
Yeah.
Casino Royale was a film that I really responded to in a big way. I very much liked that film, and Quantum of Solace was kind of detached from that for me, and it wasn't what I was expecting in terms of a follow-up, but not in a positive way. I was looking forward to doing this episode because it's a film that I haven't revisited that often since the release of the film at the cinema. We've covered it in our Bond marathons, the 2 times that I've done it, and it comes at such a point, though, where you're already quite exhausted and you're kind of drifting in and out. So every now and again you get a Bond film that gives you a chance to just close your eyes every couple of seconds. And this was that film for me in the build-up to Skyfall. I've been looking forward to this episode because it's time to really go back and give a second chance to a film that I didn't really appreciate when it was first released. But yeah, I think that gives us opportunity to be able to talk about the context of this film as well. Let's lay some foundations before we begin to talk about how we truly feel about this film now, revisiting it for the episode. So, Andy, you are the Bond expert of the two of us. You are well-read and educated in the world of film's most famous sex pest. So, tell us a little bit about Quantum of Solace. I mean, I guess we really need to begin with Casino Royale, with the release of that film and where that left Bond.
I think we need to go back further. Yeah, I think we need to go back to Die Another Day, because I think a lot of the decisions that were made on these subsequent films, and the first 2 Daniel Craig films especially, were directly influenced by the reception of Die Another Day, which was Pierce Brosnan's, although he didn't know it at the time, his last film. It's very much a blind alley, that film, because I don't know how we got to that point. If you watch GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies, An Even World Is Not Enough, I remember when I saw that film at the cinema, the leap going from that, which is, it's quite breezy, but it's very much rooted in realism, to something like Die Another Day, which is just absolutely batshit crazy and just
pure comic book pulp.
Yeah,
kind of
it really
thing.
is. Like they've gone in such a heavy comic book sci-fi, Batman and Robin style.
That's the thing. I was thinking about this not too long ago, and I wanted to ask you, Die Another Day, I feel like that's the type of Bond film that would be made now if the producers behind Bond decided, well, we want to do Bond, but like a Marvel superhero film.
Yeah,
that kind of thing, and get it completely wrong. What exactly was the inspiration back then to make Bond into this Die Another Day? I mean, what was about? Because it is so comic book pulpy and so at odds with what had come before. It makes me think that somebody's seen something. One of the producers said, let's make Bond more like this. But I don't know what this is.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was... I'm trying to think when it came out, but it might have had something to do with Triple X and films of that ilk. And Mission Impossible 2, I think, as well. So I think the influence of maybe those films, like John Woo films, because I know John Woo they wanted him to direct a Bond film at one point. I think even like Fast and the Furious as well, the very first one.
Yeah, that's starting to make more sense now, yeah.
And they just thought, we need to go a bit more high-tech with our Bond and embrace things like the CGI and things which Bond hadn't traditionally done. I don't really know who's directly to blame for those. I mean, you've got to really go to the top. You've just got to blame the directors and the producers for not saying no to the director. So
it's weird though, because it sticks out even in Lee Tamahori's filmography in terms of the style of the film. And you look at something like The Edge, it's nothing like that.
Yeah, I think the fact that Lee Tamahori ended up his next film being Triple X 2, I think that speaks volumes to where he was coming from.
Yeah, that's true.
But with that, they obviously realised, even though the film did well financially, I mean, at the time it was the highest grossing Bond film unadjusted for inflation. It was the most successful Pierce Brosnan film. But I think given the reviews and where they were headed, they felt that there was nowhere else to go.
The road had run out.
And then also, that same year, you had the very first Bourne film come out, which is obviously very important to take note of when you're talking about Quantum of Solace. And also, prior to Die Another Day, they settled their lawsuit with Kevin McClory and Columbia, which meant that the rights to Casino Royale reverted back to Eon. Well, actually, no, they didn't revert. They just gained the rights to Casino Royale at that time. And I think given the fact that Sony was involved in the subsequent Craig films, there must have been some deal with them regarding them jumping on board as sort of financiers and distributors, sort of like, if we give you these rights, can we be involved in this film sort of thing. So that was all going on behind the scenes even before Die Another Day started shooting. I think even before Die Another Day was released, I think the producers secretly were thinking that this was going to be Pierce's last film. And they just didn't tell him. So you have that awkward 4 years. I remember around 2005 where there was like, will he do a fifth one or not?
But I do remember the feeling at the time for myself was that, this probably should be Pierce Brosnan's last one.
Yeah,
there was no statement made, but there just became a general acceptance that it was Pierce Brosnan's last one, even before Daniel Craig was announced. I remember that was just from my side of things. Just like I was quite heavily on like the Empire forums at the time and that type of thing online, and there seemed to be just this general acceptance that, Pierce Brosnan's probably done now.
Yeah, I enjoy it a lot more now, but watching that film first time, I was very disappointed with Die Another Day. Probably more so than any other Bond film at the time, because it was just so outlandish, and things like that hang gliding CGI sequence was just...
I laughed a lot when I first saw that film. I went with a lot of friends from school and we just laughed all the way through it, especially the hand gliding sequence. We were howling then.
But at the time, I was a very fervent Bond fan and took it very seriously. So
of course,
things like that in the film, which were entertaining but in the completely the wrong way, it kind of pissed me off at the time, I think, that they'd made the things so frivolous. That film, every other line is an innuendo. It's just ridiculous. It was become a complete parody of itself. So there really was nowhere else to go. I mean, you could have done another Pierce Brosnan film to try and redeem something, but I don't think the producers were willing to do that, I don't think. There's a lot of preamble. I mean, there's that whole Jinx film in the middle. But ultimately, they made Casino and cast Daniel Craig The final two people were him and Henry Cavill, a very young Henry Cavill, and Martin Campbell, the director of Casino Royale. At the time, preferred Henry Cavill, but the producers really wanted Daniel, and by the end of it, Martin Campbell was very much won over by Daniel Craig. So they made Casino, and the thing is with Casino, I don't think they really knew how it was going to go. I think they were excited by what they were making, and when it comes out, it just blows everything out of the water. It made significantly more money than Die Another Day, and was very, very well reviewed. I think it's still got like 94% on Rotten Tomatoes.
That's what I noticed by that. And I always notice when a film starts to reach out to more than its core audience, and Casino Royale certainly was, because I remember my parents going to see it and then suddenly them talk, like they never really went to see Bond films at the cinema. The last one that they had seen beforehand was GoldenEye, and then they went to go see Casino Royale and they waxed lyrical about it. They loved it. And yet that's when I normally get the sense that this is reaching out to a larger audience.
Yeah.
And that one certainly did.
Yeah. I think also the fact that they didn't mention it at the time, but it was a reboot. It was a fresh start. And the fact that they abandoned many of the tropes that were associated with Bond, because I think, with Die Another Day and even some of the later Brosnan films, they got so bogged down in having to just go through the motions of having to do certain things. Casino was very much freed of all that. And I think Daniel Craig did more with his Bond than Pierce Brosnan managed to do in 4 films, like a lot more. But the original plan for Casino was to make it a 2-part film, and there was even planning in place to make it a like a back-to-back production.
Yeah.
Which Peter Lamont talks about in his book, Peter Lamont being the production designer of Casino Royale. But ultimately, that didn't happen. But Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, who are still the stalwart writers in the Eon camp, they were writing a follow-up whilst Casino was in production, and they seem to get a lot of hate, which I don't understand, because if you read their original screenplays, they're actually quite good.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit, because they're of the Eon camp, and when you get a new director coming in, they kind of want to put their own stamp on it. So they'll kind of say, not feeling the script, I want to do my interpretation of it, for better or worse.
I mean, I would very much like to see their distilled version of a Bond film, kind of unfettered.
Yeah.
I'd like to see their take on it without any dilution, essentially. Like, I would like to see them move into a directing role to see what, given the opportunity, exactly what their Bond film would be. Because I guess I've read about them being described as workmanlike within the Bond framework, but actually I think they bring a lot to it and a lot of knowledge of Bond to the franchise as well.
Yeah.
And I always feel like you say, they catch a lot of flack for rewrites and work that isn't their own. And when certainly you do a little bit of cursory reading into what some of their ideas are, there's some really sharp and interesting ideas at play, even in some of their worst films.
Yeah, there's that Die Another Day script-to-screen documentary, and obviously that's the only film that they are solely credited for writing the screenplay, and I think they get a lot of flack for that. But when you even just watch that documentary, you get the sense that hardly any of it is their own work, and they are just being made to do things by other people.
Yeah.
And there should be many more names on the screenplay than there actually are. And it's, and also, the strongest elements of that film, which is all the North Korea stuff, is what they started with. And all the other bollocks, like in the second half of the film especially, are more sort of the Lee Tamahori influence. So, yeah, again, they get a lot of flack, and it's not really their fault. I don't think that's the film they wanted to make. You know the difference, because they wrote Die Another Day, but they also wrote Casino Royale. Even though Paul Haggis was involved in that script, it was only a final pass. If you look at the actual shooting script, it says by Neil Purvis and Robert Wade with revisions by Paul Haggis. So it's not like he's come in just to do a, spit and polish on the thing. Yeah,
I do wonder if there's some WGA tinkering at work in regards to the crediting of those films.
Yeah.
In order to give Paul Haggis more of a credit.
Yeah. Anyway, even as far back as the press conference in 2005 for Casino, Michael G. Wilson, the producer, had already mentioned that they were actually working on the follow-up. And the original plan, was to film it back-to-back. That didn't turn out to be the case. I think partly because of the unwieldiness of doing that. And also, I think they were hedging the bets because they didn't know how it was going to go. And also, I don't think Martin Campbell would commit to directing another film. He famously likes to just direct one film and then move on and recharge his batteries. So this whole 2-part thing, and they knew where they wanted to go with it because they kind of took the jumping off point of this betrayal by Vesper. So Purvis and Wade worked on a few drafts, and there's a little bit in this Some Kind of Hero book which goes into what it would have been like. And I think what they had was, it was much stronger than what they ended up with, and we'll go into why in a bit. So the idea was that Vesper had this boyfriend, which is mentioned at the end of Casino Royale, and the fact that she was being blackmailed by that boyfriend. I've got a quote from Wade here, and basically says, our big idea was the boyfriend who was being held in Algeria was never a prisoner. It was just blackmail. She'd been ensnared, and it gives Bond a target. Her life has been ruined, and he goes after this guy. So it was more like a manhunt for this guy, which it is a little bit in the final film, but feels very much tacked on.
Yeah, that's part of my issue. It's dealt with in like a coda, but the film very quickly becomes not about that.
Yeah. He continues, our version starts where the eventual movie starts. Bond's got Mr. White in the boot of the car. Mr. White is handed over to the CIA for questioning. Bond, unbeknownst to Mr. White, allows him to escape, only to follow him and be led to White's ultimate employers. White goes to the Palio in Siena, a passion of his, knowing he is to be killed by his own organisation. Bond turns up and witnesses White dually being shot by his own outfit. Bond pursues the killer across the Palio, ending in a rope fight where 007 kills the hitman. Bond is now in trouble as a vital lead is dead. Money that Mr. White has collected at the end of Casino Royale is now being used by a new mysterious organisation, Quantum, which is hiding in plain sight at OPEC. The villain named Dante is in league with the boyfriend of Vesper, Yusuf Kabira, and then Bond infiltrates the organisation and takes the next job of the assassin he killed in Siena. So it is a little bit like the final film, but I think the structure and the connective tissue is a much stronger narrative through liner. I like the idea of Bond letting Mr. White go in order to follow him, and the whole... Even though you have a version of that fight at the Palio in Siena, it just makes a much more interesting narrative sense to go down that route.
Yeah, because I would say, speaking about this for a moment, the element that you've just touched upon, Yusuf being a larger part of that story, that's always been an issue with me with Quantum of Solace, is the fact that it reduces that role in the film, that it actually kind of loses its way. And I think by having, like with the Purvis and Wade draft, having that character have more of a central standing within the film itself, you never lose sight of what it's about then. You know that the whole film is still a reaction to Vesper. I think the eventual film that we do get loses sight of that quite quickly, and it doesn't really come back around to it until the end. And it is a coda, essentially. It's not part of the film itself. It's not built into a reveal or anything like that. It's not even a significant moment in the film. It's just something that's tacked on at the end. I think by having him in the middle of the film, it makes the film about Vesper and Bond's reaction to that. And I think it would have been a stronger film if that was the script we went with then.
Yeah, I think so. Quantum, as it is, it falls between two stools because it's a direct sequel to Casino, but there is very little connective tissue between the two films, both in the story and also stylistically. But also because it's so connected to Casino, it can't stand on its own 2 feet. It's forever tied, but it's not capitalizing on the things that are tying it together. So it's neither one thing or the other. And I kind of get the feeling that for general audiences, this film, I mean, this could be on Best Forgotten Movies because this film feels so forgotten now.
It does. It really does.
Because Casino and Quantum's follow-up, Skyfall, were so successful and well received by general audiences, I would say for the average viewer, they would have completely forgotten that there was a film in the middle.
Yeah.
And I think it's partly to do with the fact that, one, because it's so short and it doesn't really make much of an impact in that way, but also because, it's not got its own central statement or reason for existing because it's kind of been carved away. We need to see why that's been the case, because obviously Martin Campbell was not going to return to direct a follow-up to Casino, so they had to find another director. And they did have one in mind, somebody they'd asked to do Casino but had turned them down. And this was Roger Michell, who was probably most famous for directing Notting Hill. and The Mother with Daniel Craig.
Yeah.
Notting Hill was the biggest film he'd made up to that point. A lot of his other films are very, very small scale British dramas.
Yeah, and he's a very strange choice
Yeah.
for this type of film. Like, looking at his filmography before and since, it's not really in his forte to do big action pieces. And it does make me wonder, outside of the Daniel Craig connection, I mean, he clearly has a very strong relationship to him. What is it that they saw in him as an action director? I mean, this is one thing that I wanted to speak about when it comes to this film in particular. It does feel like they've dealt with the action as a secondary element, and they've thought, whatever we're going to make it, that's what the action is. They know all the right people. They normally populate it with all the right people. And it's like they thought, well, for all the talky bits, we need somebody else. We need somebody to bring a bit of vision to that. So that's more where the interests lie, I think. When they're targeting these directors for this film, it feels like they've been more targeted for their dramas rather than action pieces. Because even Mark Forster is a very strange director for this type of film.
Yeah. So he was hired in early 2006, and he wasn't impressed with the draft that Purvis and Wade had come up with, I imagine, again, because he wanted to put his own stamp on it, because he collaborated with Ted Griffin on a 10-page outline for his own version of the film, and it sounds fucking terrible.
It really does.
It sounded like Die Another Day 2. With planes falling out of the sky, a guy like he wanted to gain control of the internet.
I laughed when I read that.
Oh.
I really did. It seems like an old person's idea of what the internet is.
Yeah.
You know, he's got...
It just sounds fucking stupid, and I'm so glad that the Bond producers felt the same. Because, the Bond producers did not like his idea at all. So, at this point, because he doesn't like the original script and they didn't like his new idea, they basically back to square one with this director. And around this point, he starts getting cold feet because he's starting to have meetings with peripherals. Like you would do in a big franchise film, you have to start talking to, the marketing, the tie-in people,
the video game people.
The people making the video game, and ask him for ideas. And he was like, we haven't got a script. And at this point, the film is set to be released in May 2008. They were planning it on it being an 18-month turnaround from Casino. I don't really understand why that was the thing.
Yeah.
Because traditionally, at this point, Bond was every 2 or 3 years. So I don't understand the whole logic behind trying to make it follow it up quicker. It didn't make sense to me anyway. So he gets cold feet, walks into the office and says, sorry, I can't do this anymore. And I'm pretty sure he's only on the film about a month or something. They've got no script, or they have to go back to the old script. Got no director. And he leaves in early 2007. So you've got 9 months before they are meant to start shooting.
I was going to say, shooting is imminent.
There's some other directors that are in consideration.
Oh, when I read this list of directors that are in consideration, it did make me wince a little bit. Like, oh, could you imagine if we had got that version of the film?
Yeah, so you've got people like Tony Scott.
Yeah, which was one that I actually was like, I would have liked to have seen Tony Scott's Bond film.
Jonathan Mustow.
Oh.
No. And Alex Proyas, which would be interesting if you get him on a good day.
Yes, absolutely.
If you get him on a Crow Dark City day, but not a
Gods of Egypt
day. Oh, he's a strange old director, But Mark Forster is eventually hired in June 2007, and he was surprised as everyone else was, because he's a non-Commonwealth director, the very first one that they hired, and was not a big fan of Bond, which I'm still deliberating whether that was a good idea or not.
I think every now and again, in a franchise like Bond, where your next film's a guarantee anyway, and this is a franchise that is going to continue in perpetuity. So I think every now and again, it's good to get somebody in.
Yeah, I like that they took the risk.
Yeah, that doesn't get it. That's like, I'm not the biggest fan of Bond, but if I was doing one, this was what my take would be. And that way, you might get like an interesting result from that. I think every now and again, it's good to take that kind of risk. It doesn't pay off, and I don't think it really pays off here, but I appreciate the risk that was taken.
He accepts the job based on Casino Royale. And I think also Sony is enthused because it's Amy Pascal in charge at the time. And she'd already worked with him on Stranger Than Fiction. So everyone was kind of on board for this idea. I think when looking at the script, I think he thought there was something in there, but he wanted to take it down his own direction. And he came up with the idea of basing it around water and natural resources. And that was the big theme of this film in terms of who's in charge of that.
I don't know how this goes down with fans of the series, but I like that element.
Yeah, I think the issue is, like everything in this film, I don't think this idea was implemented into the film heavily enough for it to have much impact, because it feels, again, very much on the peripheral end. It doesn't really impact the characters or the surrounding area. I mean, you've got a few shots of people going, "Where's the water?"
Yeah, exactly.
That's it. And you've got a shot of a dam, and that's about it. And then you've got a scene about water utilities. So I think the way that they put it across in the film is not very exciting.
I agree. Yeah.
And I think also people were like, you've got this organization, which is basically Spectre in all but name, and that's the most exciting scheme you can come up with for a follow-up to Casino Royale.
The thing is with that, I like that it's about water, essentially, just in terms of the resource. But I agree with you that the way in which it has been implemented is completely wrong. And because it doesn't really feel like it's part of the film, as you mentioned, like many things, it just feels like it's floating on the surface. And it doesn't go any further than that. But to use another film that I was thinking of in regards to that particular element that they use it in, they actually use it in Mission Impossible Fallout. That whole plot becomes about actually a drought.
Yeah.
That's what the bomb thing at the end was in regards to create a drought. But that implements it in a much more exciting and lavish way. I think this needed to be, like you say, more of a central element where you get to see the impact on the world that this is already having.
Yeah.
Rather than just that one scene of them walking through a village.
Yeah. And I think when we go into how this film was eventually written, it explains a lot as to why a lot of this stuff is undeveloped. So on Forster's hiring, Paul Haggis was very reluctant to return to rewrite the film because he didn't really want to follow up Casino. He didn't want to be the guy that was tasked with following up his work on Casino. You've got a situation where you've got a script that not everyone's on board with, that needs a lot of work for whatever reason. And then you've got someone to come and rewrite it who doesn't really want to come in and rewrite it. And then on top of that, you've got the Writers Guild of America strike of 2007 to 8.
Yeah.
So Haggis is only able to deliver 2 drafts of the screenplay and a few polish, and finishes that 2 hours before the strike begins. So they've got a script that's had more work and had some ideas implemented into it, but is still not finished. And they've got a couple of months before they've got to start filming.
I remember how heavily publicised this was as well regarding the film, about how the writing strike had crippled it.
Yeah. I remember it was at Heroes, they had to cut the series in half because of the writer's strike. And
they
things
did,
like that.
yeah.
And it never recovered after that, I don't think, that show.
You can even see it, because we still get a lot of these type of shows still being shown on TV now over here. But like, I was watching Scrubs the other day, weirdly, it was just on TV, and it was the episodes in which they had made around the writer's strike. And you can see by the release of those episodes, they've played about with the release of the episodes because of the writer's strike. But now, divorced from the writer's strike, it doesn't make sense, because one character leaves in one episode and then is back for the next one, and then the one after is gone again, and then in the one after he's back again. And it's like, you can really see how it meddled. You can still see it if you just observe the films and TV shows that were made then. You can really see how shaky it left the landscape of film and TV.
Yeah. So they got a guy called Joshua Zatuma to rewrite some of the script. I imagine he's obviously not a guild member, but they were basically left with a situation where the script wasn't ready and they had to start. So it was left to Mark Forster and Daniel Craig to thrash out the film on set. I've got a very eloquent quote from Daniel Craig in his own style. So, we were fucked. We had the bare bones of a script. Me and the director were the ones allowed to rewrite it. The rules were that you couldn't employ anyone as a writer, but the actor and director could work on scenes together. I say to myself, never again, but who knows? There was me trying to rewrite scenes, and a writer I am not.
No, I think one of their lines, it must be, because this is one that really sticks out to me every time I've seen the film. It's a moment for a really badass line. You know, every action film gets a moment where the main guy gets to say something before or after he's killed someone, and it makes a real impact. And it's at the end of the film, just before the most fragile hotel in the world blows up. But Bond falls on somebody's car, and just before he shoots this bad guy, he says, "You and I have a mutual friend." Bang! Dead. I was like, that's the worst. The worst sign-off line for a character. It's like, I first met Mathis in... It feels like he's about to begin a speech.
I saw you as a mutual friend on Facebook. I wrote in my notes whilst watching the film, there are no great villain deaths in this film.
One man does get his pants blown off. If you slow down the film, there's a man who...
What is it, Elvis?
Yeah, he gets his pants blown off. You just...
I want to slow that down now.
I'm not even joking.
I was going to say, for a character as undeveloped as Elvis, he gets the best death.
Yeah.
Dominic Green leaves him to hold fort, knowing full well that the thing's going to blow up any moment. But this is a film.
Is it, though? Is it?
Well...
I thought it was a pamphlet.
But the thing is, I think what we need to go into now is the actual production of the film, because I think this is part of the issue, because I feel like Quantum is a load of action sequences joined together by toilet tissue with bits of dialogue on it. So it's like you've got like storyboarded action sequences or an idea for an action sequence, and then you've got literally written on toilet paper dialogue that's supposed to hold it together. It does feel like that way. Yeah. I get the feeling with Quantum. One, they're trying to rush to the end. They're just in a real hurry to get to the finish. And two, all the dialogue scenes feel so rushed. There's no time to breathe, even in the dialogue sequences. Everything feels so condensed in a kind of artificial way. I mean, this is where we probably need to go into sort of Mark Forster's philosophies about this film. And I don't know why they thought this was a good idea, because Casino had been so well received and people appreciated that it took its time and it developed things in a way that Bond had never done before. But Mark Forster comes in. His main note from watching Casino was that it was too long. And he wanted to make his follow-up. He describes it as being like a bullet.
It is weird, though, when you look at it that way, because Casino Royale, I understand we are going to go into this very shortly, but in terms of the inspiration of the Bourne franchise on Bond in general, and in terms of the rejuvenation of Bond. But Casino Royale, although it did feel like they were bringing the Bond franchise into the real world and making it more contemporary, it also feels very traditionally structured. And it still feels like it's got many traditional elements as well. Not just of the Bond franchise, but just like in terms of like you say, it gives it time to breathe. It's paced well, that film.
Yeah.
It's got some structural issues that I've always gone into just in terms of the act breaks.
Yeah.
But the act breaks are very defined.
It feels like three films bolted together, doesn't it? Yeah.
That's it, yeah. There's not much blend between the act breaks. It's like end of part one, bang. You know, it's very episodic in that way. But I still very much appreciate it, and appreciate that slow build, that traditional slow build. This one feels like they've just thrust the film forward without any thought, really, or reason as to why. And I do have some thoughts further on that, but I'm going to save it until later in the episode.
Yeah. So in addition to that, he has a very much an attitude, even though things work so well on the last film, of being a new broom. It's not a bad thing, but I think given the success that they kind of already just had the new broom, he's sort of a new broom for the new broom.
A new broom like that guy in the background of the dock scene who's sweeping up. That always does the rounds.
Yeah.
And he's about a foot off the floor. His broom is just gliding in the air.
So even though Casino was a reboot, they made a lot more changes with this film than they did the last film. So you've got a new production designer, you've got a new company doing the titles, you've got a new second unit director, costume designer, and the list goes on and on.
It is weird after like re-establishing the series. Like, this is what we're re-establishing Bond as, to then like turf out the entire production crew.
Yeah. I mean, I've got a quote here as well from Peter Lamont's book, which I think is quite insightful, because if you read anywhere else, it's just stated that Peter Lamont, who was the production designer on Casino, who had obviously been doing it for an awful long time, official statement says that Peter Lamont retired after Casino Royale.
Yeah.
But he was actually in talks for doing Quantum. I've got a quote from him here from his book, Man with a Golden Eye. He says, when we made Casino Royale, there was talk of doing something we'd never attempted before and making the next film, Quantum of Solace, back to back. I had hoped to stay with the production, especially if Martin Campbell was going to direct. Quantum of Solace would prove to be a standalone production, and a new director, Mark Forster, was assigned. In spring 2007, Ian flew me out to Los Angeles for a meeting with Mark. It didn't go particularly well. I sensed he was wary of working with someone who was 40 years his senior. Perhaps more seriously, I think he suspected I might be more sympathetic to the producers than to him. My loyalty to Michael and Barbara was beyond question, and I believe they wanted me to work on the picture, but ever since Cubby had promoted me to production designer, I had always been chosen by the director and I had worked for him. I was never a producer's man. I tried to help everybody. I respected Mark's feelings, but told him that if I was to leave the Bond series, I didn't want to hear it from anyone other than Michael and Barbara. They were kind enough to call me in for a chat, but they explained the films were moving on without me.
That's really sad.
Yeah.
We've met Peter Lamont, and he's a lovely man.
He's a really nice man. He's a lovely man.
But even when we met him, I would say, you could still feel the tinge with sadness that his career kind of petered out when it did, that his retirement had come when it did, because even though when we met him he wasn't in a place where he was able to work because his eyesight was causing him issues, he still felt like from our conversation that he had more to give when his retirement had happened. Like he still had a few years, a few more projects left in him. And I think because when you approach artists like that, and Peter Lamont is an artist, and when you approach them, I think they're the type of people that want to stop when they physically cannot anymore.
Yeah.
And I feel like he's been deprived just that last couple of projects, and you could feel that weight when speaking to him about that.
Yeah, I think so. But at least he managed to, finish on a very well-received film. So,
absolutely.
He kind of dodged a bullet in a way. But I think from this new broom, I think the two most significant people to come out of this were, one, the fact that they changed the designer of Bond's suits. So I think from GoldenEye all the way up until Casino, they'd been designed by a company called Brioni.
Was it Tom Ford for Quantum of Solace?
Yeah, for Quantum, they got Tom Ford. And I think his approach has been very influential. I think when people see Daniel Craig now as Bond, they see him in Tom Ford suits. I think it's something that really makes him stand out from all the other Bonds in the way that his suits have been tailored and the way he looks, and his silhouette is very distinctive from all the other Bonds now because of those Tom Ford suits. I think that's a big positive from this film.
Huge positive, yeah.
Yeah. They did get a new costume designer for this though as well. It was Lindy Hemming in the previous film, and they changed it to Louise Frogley for this film.
Because I was speaking to somebody about the costume choice, and one of them, I was speaking to John Rain on Twitter, who everybody will know from Smersh Pod, which is certainly a podcast about Bond that everybody should listen to.
Yeah.
It's quite fantastic, but I made a mention that this film had Daniel Craig's worst haircut, and he said he's got tiny sunglasses as well. And sure enough, the next scene came up, and it looked like he'd picked up his fucking kid's sunglasses on the way out the door. He's got like the tiniest, like they're really central in his head. The tiniest sunglasses. That's why I had to ask, beyond the suits, did he do any of the costume work? Because there are some bold, if not pretty questionable choices for some of the things that have been decided.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of new ideas, some of which worked and some which don't. But I think the other big significant change in production, which is now the odd one out because Alexander Witt has been the second unit director. He was on Casino, but he's also, barring this film, continued on with Skyfall, Spectre, and No Time to Die. Yeah. So for one night only, our second unit director is Dan Bradley, who is the second unit director on the Bourne films, which is incredibly significant for this film.
Incredibly so.
And I'm not entirely sure how the action sequences came about in terms of the script. They do feel like very separate to the script, but Mark Forster had the idea that he wanted to base the action sequences around the themes of earth, water, air, and fire.
Yeah.
That does come across in the action sequences as pretty much, it's a bit of a grab bag of everything for this film. Yeah. It's like, let's do everything. There's the car chase, there's the boat chase, there's the plane chase, there's a firefight, there's everything you could possibly think of in this film.
Yeah. I can see in the sense of walking into a pitch meeting and saying, so what's your idea of what the action scenes are going to be? Well, I've got this idea that it's actually going to be about the elements. That's what our action scenes are going to be. It's going to be earth, fire, water, blah, 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 so on, so on. And I can see how pitching it would be a good idea, but actually when it comes to the execution, it means that the action scenes don't really have any character. They're just, like you say, a bit of a grab bag. They're all over the place.
Yeah. When you're watching the film, you're kind of just waiting for the next action sequence.
For the next one, it's like you're waiting for a plane to turn up.
Sometimes the action just interrupts the dialogue. Especially in that plane fight. Yeah, we're actually having a good conversation. Oh, sorry, there's an action sequence. Just interrupting the flow. There's a lot of that. And I don't think it would be as problematic if you could actually see what was going on. Because there are moments in the film where it does settle down for a while, but you just know in the back of your mind that there's another action sequence coming soon.
Yeah.
The way that this film has been put together, I think for everyone involved in the production, they made a Bond film. It's their experience.
Yeah.
It was just as much work and time consuming as making Casino or Skyfall either side, but the final result on screen feels so slight and like an advert of the film that it doesn't feel like the film itself actually happened in a way. It's like, no wonder people forget about it because it doesn't feel like it's a full-length film. It feels like so abbreviated.
Yes. Because of that kind of speediness to it and how inconsequential it ends up feeling. And this is why I was so disappointed with it when I first saw it, was I do feel like it kind of snuffs out the fire that Casino Royale set very quickly. Yeah. And because it's in such a rush to just get to the finish line, essentially, and because it doesn't let any dwell and doesn't have any impact, by the end of it, you're just like, so what have I just seen? What has anybody learned? What's happened?
What are the new developments?
Exactly, yeah. What's next?
I think Daniel Craig must have been the most disappointed for that it made so little impact, because for him, it ended up having a huge impact on him physically. I mean, he put himself through the ringer on this one. I mean, he describes Casino as being a walk in the park compared to doing this film, and it's a shame that you can barely see any of it because he was injured numerous times on set. I mean, I've got the list here. Like, he had a cut to his face, which required 4 stitches and later plastic surgery. He pulled out his shoulder, which required 6 surgical screws, and he sliced the top of his finger off.
I remember the finger one being a thing that was publicised at the time. Is that why I saw some promotional material and his arm is in a sling?
Yeah.
Is that due to the pins being placed in his shoulder?
Yeah.
Jesus. That's such like all of that torment and pain.
Yeah.
For something that you really cannot appreciate.
Even though you can't really see an awful lot of it, you do get the sense that he threw himself into this. Like, there's very little use of doubles. You can see that he's there all the time.
Like that scaffolding fight, for example. I was thinking about this. It's not so much the shot choice as well. It's the speediness of the editing.
Yeah.
And what it's cutting to. And the frantic pacing of that. It's like, as I mentioned before, it just leaves you with an impression of an action scene.
Yeah.
And you get the feeling that things are happening. If you pause it at certain times, it's like, from a shot-to-shot basis, you're like, wow, that's really quite dangerous. Wow, that's really quite exciting. But when you put it all together with, like, millisecond cuts, it just becomes a mess. It's just so chaotic.
If there was ever a Bond film that needed to be re-edited from the ground up, this is the candidate. Because when you look at all the behind the scenes footage as well of everything, but that sequence especially, it's a massive set.
Yeah.
They built this huge set to do the sequence in. And when you look at it, when you see like the B-roll of them doing all this stuff, it looks really impressive. And the same goes for every single sequence that's in the film. But the way they put this together, it robs it of any coherence. There's no geography. It doesn't look as impressive as it should do.
Yeah.
I don't know who had the idea to put the film together in this way. I mean, I know they didn't have much time, but they didn't have any less time than any other Bond team. Bond films are notorious for having a very short post-production time. I think it's because, as we've gone on before, when you're talking about film budgets and it being like a short-term loan, Eon are very good at returning their money. It's quite funny at the moment because obviously they're not returning their money on No Time to Die, but The reason the films begin production so close to the release date, I think, is that they can regain their money back quicker than most films can do. But it does mean that the post-production time is very, very short. So instead of having something like 14 weeks to edit your film, which is what Forster usually had, they had like 5 to 6 weeks to edit the whole film.
That's just impossible.
I mean, they would have been doing stuff as they were shooting.
As they went, yeah.
Bond traditionally does edit during production. Like if they have a sequence, they will start putting it together. But even so, ultimately, I think Mark Forster was just too ambitious for the time that he had and the fact that the script wasn't finished.
How can you focus on putting the action together coherently when you haven't got important character work done? If you're too busy, like on a day-to-day basis, still writing the script as you're shooting it, that's less time that you get to actually think about the shooting of the film and how it's going to be put together. Obviously, it works for some directors. Ridley Scott does it every now and again, and it has a hit and miss thing with that. Some directors do get away with it. This is a film that hasn't gotten away with it. And I think Mark Forster as well, at the time, he's a very inexperienced director when it comes to this type of film. It's the first film of this type that he's made. And I will say something quite controversial about this as well. I actually don't think this film is terribly shot. One of the things that's often leveled at this film is that it's about shaky cam. I think the shaky cam is exacerbated by the editing. There are some shots where it loses focus of what we're supposed to be looking at, but that's just part of the frantic choice that they've gone for. But if you look at it on a shot-to-shot basis, it's not a bad-looking film. The camera work, in terms of the shot composition, most of the time, 90% of the time, I know what I'm supposed to be looking at. I think it's the way that the film's been put together is the issue.
Yeah, it's all in that. The cinematography is actually quite nice. Is it Roberto Schaefer who's the DOP on this one, I think?
I will concede to you, my sir. I
think it's him, but yeah, I think he did a pretty good job. And I think a lot of the issues, apart from obviously the script itself, which does feel incredibly unfinished at times, the main issue is how it's put together. And I would love to be sent all the rushes for this film and put the film together. This is like preaching directly to Eon now. Like, I know this film's probably a bit of a sore spot now because they seem to have brushed this film under the rug somewhat. But I think there's quite a lot of potential in this film to be a lot better than it is. And I feel like you've got all this footage. All this footage will have been archived somewhere. And I feel like if there was ever a Bond film that would benefit from a new edition, this would be the one, because I think there is something in there, and I think it is a very, they spent so much money on this film, and this is a $225 million film.
Yeah.
There must be so much footage that's just on the floor that was wasted, and you have to watch the film many, many, many times to get what the action is. But the way that it's staged, there is actually a proper through line with all this action, but it's the way that it's been put together that's made it seem like it's way more chaotic than it actually is. It's really oddly paced. I mean, I'm not sure whether you noticed that. Given all the fast cutting and the action sequences, usually directly after, you have... The best example I've got is the boat chase.
Yeah.
The boat chase is so incoherent, and that one has the added disadvantage of them having to put dialogue in that scene as well, because some of the other sequences are not as bad because they're just visceral. There's no dialogue going on, but it's followed by some excessively long shots that add absolutely nothing to the story or the scene. When he's driving the boat away and then he's driving to shore, those scenes are, for some weird reason, really still and really long. And it makes the pacing feel so off kilter because you've just gone from that hugely fastly cut sequence that's just chaotic.
And it's ground to a sudden break.
To these overly long still shots of nothing.
No information, no nothing.
Yeah, it's really odd. And the whole film is like that.
Yeah. Now, I've got a question for you. And I certainly have an opinion about this, but at the time, I remember with the release of these films, there was a somewhat vocal portion of the fan base that were very upset about the lack of a gun barrel sequence at the beginning of the film. And I want to speak to you about that. What is your opinion of the lack of the gun barrel sequence with this film?
I remember when I first saw it being very disappointed, actually, because this is something to talk about when you talk about the Craig films as a whole, because Casino Royale gets a free pass because it does something differently with its opening title sequence anyway, and it does actually have some sort of gun barrel at the start.
And it really works.
And it works on a narrative purpose as well, so that's fine. That gives a free pass. But I'm holding out my judgment for Daniel Craig's last film, because Casino aside, they have fucked up the gun barrel so many fucking times. And the thing is, people think, oh, it's not important, it's the gun barrel. But I think it is very important, because I think it is something that is one of those bits of the Bond formula that separates it from all of the films, and taking that away or not having it in its traditional position, I think it does diminish the effect of the film somewhat, because it's saying at the front, we are uncomfortable with being a Bond movie.
Yeah.
And you get the same problem with Skyfall, where they put it at the end as well. I mean, that's because they couldn't make it work with the opening shot, but I think really they should have
designed the beginning of the film,
and they try it again in Spectre, but again fuck it up for very pretentious reasons as well. It feels like with the Daniel Craig films, they're still very uncomfortable with some of the established Bond formula, and it's something that they got rid of that they didn't really need to get rid of. And I think it was, and putting it at the end again, it feels like another tacked on element that they've just sort of, oh yeah, we need to do that.
I would say, my opinion is, this was me at the time. I was of the opinion that the gun barrel sequence did not matter. I did not care. I really like a gun barrel sequence in a Bond film, but with the way that this opened, I understood the statement that they were making with the type of Bond film that it was going to be. I actually like the way that opens with the long helicopter shot coming into the roadway, the tunnel, and the quick glimpses of Bond driving the car being pursued by another vehicle. I liked the way that was put together, and I thought it was a good introduction. It's all downhill from there, mind. But at the time, I really quite liked that open for the film. However, I think looking at it now in its place within the Bond films, the Daniel Craig Bond films, and how they fumbled the gun barrel sequence time after time, I think it's another missed opportunity to have that sequence and do it justice. I think it becomes frustrating when we look at it from the point of them not having gotten that part of the film right for Daniel Craig's essentially his whole run as Bond so far. And it becomes more frustrating as a point of that.
Yeah, I think it set the precedent that it was less important.
Yes, yeah. And I get that, especially in the place from where these Bond films are starting from, though, I get that they've given themselves the opportunity to retool and rebuild the Bond franchise, not quite from the ground up, but from a certain point, and they slowly reintroduce more of the traditional elements as the series goes on, such as M and Q and that type of thing. So I think, yeah, okay, Quantum of Solace, you can probably kind of get away with it, but then to go to Skyfall and still not have a gun barrel sequence, and then for Spectre to do it, well, not
half-heartedly.
Yeah, to do it so half-heartedly that I now see where the fan base was coming from in this regard, because it set a shaky precedent.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to talk about, which I found a little bit jarring and made the film more incoherent, is the use of titles and subtitles, because it uses them very liberally and in a very stylized way, but in a way that I think distracts.
Well, I agree. I actually wrote in my notes that I really like the titling idea, what they've gone with for the titles, but the issue is that there's so many of them so quickly and so often, which I think is less of an issue for me personally with the idea of like the stylistic choice of the titles that they've gone with, but more so just with the fact that this film just fucking is a constant rush from one location to the next.
Yeah, its geography is a bit screwy as well. It seems to there seems to be no context in the distances between all these places as well. I think the worst example of the subtitling is when they're in La Paz in the taxi, and there's like two conversation streams going on at the same time with two different color subtitles, and I'm like, what am I supposed to be reading?
Yeah, exactly.
I've done it several times when I've just decided to read one stream over the other. The real issue with the film is everything's just sensory visual overload.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Constantly.
It's batting you over the head.
Batting over the head, yeah. Just never having any time to breathe at the appropriate moment. And it starts from the beginning as well, like right from the beginning. You have that cocktail of just not being able to see what's going on. You've got subtitles going on that you're supposed to read really fast. You can just tell from the beginning that it's a mess. And that opening sequence with the car chase, when you look at the behind the scenes footage, it's so elaborate.
Yeah.
All the setups they had.
And you look at the locations as well, like it's that famous tunnel, then it's on like a quarry. If you stop it, it looks great. Like, this is a grand location, fantastic. But it's also like down to choices such as the types of vehicle that they've gone for involved in the chase. I keep on losing sight of which vehicle I'm supposed to be looking at and which vehicle Bond's in.
That's the big issue with all the action sequences. There's never any geography to the sequences. You never really know where you are or what you're supposed to be following, and where you are on the landscape as well. Like, that's quite important when you're doing action sequences, that you really should have some sort of context as to where you are in the scene. I think they must have had it, because when you look at the way that they've been shot and all the behind the scenes footage, I just feel sorry for the crew members that were involved in all these sequences. Must have looked back on the finished version and just put their head in their hands, because it's like, all our work's not here, and it makes us look fucking incompetent.
Yeah. Now, I guess it's a time for me to talk about Paul Greengrass as well, and the influence of Bourne on the Bond franchise, because I think the influence of Bourne on the Bond franchise is something that cannot be underplayed. But with Casino Royale, I know a lot of people at the time described it, weirdly enough, as a Bourne ripoff, which I think is not correct in any way, shape or form. I think Bourne certainly influenced the way in which Bond had to revolutionize itself, essentially, to move forward. It realized that actually Die Another Day took the series so far back that it no longer met what the contemporary standards were and what audiences wanted. And Bourne was that type of thing. So they looked at that and said, well, we need to start looking at how we look at Bond. And they simply took the idea of, well, let's place Bond in the real world, is where they took it to a certain degree. But that's about as far as that goes. It's just a grittier, real world take on Bond, which, to be honest, when you look at the books anyway, it's more in line with what's included in those early Ian Fleming books. But I think Quantum of Solace is the ripoff.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
That everybody talks about. It's weird to me that they've established this new look and feel for Bond that still feels a little bit traditional, but it also feels very contemporary. And then they've abandoned that in the next film completely.
Yeah.
And they've gone with a basic rip-off in terms of the look and feel for the film. But the reason that Bourne works so well with that type of shaky camera and frantic editing is because Paul Greengrass is the only person that can do that. I watch those films, I still know what I'm looking at. It's so frantically edited, but I always know what I'm looking at. I always know what my focal point is, and I never lose sight of what's happening in that sequence. With this film, it's like somebody trying to do that with none of the experience, and it brought the series down for me in a way.
Yeah, I think so. And I think whenever Bond's tried to follow a trend, it's not really worked. I mean, I don't want to mention it too much, but Spectre tried to do a similar thing by following a trend, and that failed big time. I mean, that's for another day, because we're trying desperately not to talk about Spectre. I think around the same time I did watch the Bourne films alongside Quantum, just for comparison one time, and the action sequences in Quantum are so much more incomprehensible than the Bourne stuff. The Bourne stuff's very conservative compared to this. This is just like, it's the nadir of that style.
Yeah.
If I'd been involved in the staging of the sequences and watched the film back, I would have been angry. I've been really pissed off. None of it's there to see on the screen.
No, and it puts too much emphasis on the editing to create a sense of energy, where really things such as your blocking and your shot composition, your choreography, those are things in which you should be deriving your energy. It's why I'm happy now that when we look at action films, they've moved past this idea that the energy is derived from how much your camera shakes and how quickly you can edit a sequence. It's more so derived by fluid, long shot camera moves where It's about what the character is doing within the shot and how they're moving, how the camera moves in relation to the character and that type of thing. And the editing is once more become more about something that you don't notice.
Yeah.
For a time, action films became about, and I really keep saying this, about creating the impression of an action sequence. It became about creating a feeling of action rather than showing us action itself. And this really falls into the category of being that. And it is one of the worst examples of that, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it's because there's so much action in this film as well.
Yeah.
But having said that, I want to talk about a positive of this film, which I think this film probably does better than the two films either side of it.
Catering.
Catering. Yeah. But I think the thing that this film has on its side, and I think it does it better than Casino or Skyfall, is its use of location work, because this film has the most location work than any other Bond film. And they went to the most countries, I think. They went to UK, Chile, Panama, Italy, Austria, and Mexico. I think it lends the film, even though Panama's doubling for Bolivia and Port-au-Prince, it has a degree of authenticity about it that the other two films either side don't quite have, because I think you have that issue with Casino because they filmed a lot of it in Prague. There's the bit that I'm always a bit unsure about. You know, when they try and double Miami for Prague. So you got that bit of the museum and then the bit of the airport, which is supposed to be a Miami airport. It's so obviously not Miami airport or anywhere in Miami.
Clearly Eastern Europe.
Clearly Eastern Europe, and they've just put some palm trees up.
Yeah.
And
that period of time in filmmaking, loads of films shot at Prague. It was crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the Omen remake.
Yeah.
That's the worst example of that, though. Like, that's fucking horrendous.
Prague for London.
Oh, it's like Prague, but they just put like a London bus in the background or an underground sign.
They didn't even hide like the trams. London doesn't have trams.
No. And there's the London Eye at the back of every shot.
Yeah, just out on the top of whatever building.
Every single fucking shot, like where there's a skyline, you can see the London Eye in that film.
Big Ben's on the wrong side of the river as well.
But even in Skyfall, like, because they didn't really shoot in that many locations, I think they only actually shot in Turkey and in the UK, and there was a splinter unit that did some like second unit stuff in Shanghai. Skyfall, because I watched it like a couple of days before watching Quantum, it has a certain sort of artificiality about it.
Yeah.
It feels a bit soundstagey. You don't quite buy that he's been to some of those locations. I think the most obvious is the China sequences, the Macau sequences, where it feels a bit fake. I would say that is a minus point for that film. This film, you do genuinely feel like you were in the places where they say.
Yeah.
They captured the essence of those places quite well, I think. So I'm giving that as a positive for Quantum, because for all of its faults, you do genuinely feel like you were in Austria. You do genuinely feel like you are in Bolivia, or even in London. It feels very Londony.
Yeah, I've written as well that it does feel like an international adventure.
Yeah,
that's certainly a positive that I agree that it can get rather muddled as to the impact of these locations is dulled when the film rushes through them. But the fact that they are there, I think, does show through. And it does feel like an international globe-trotting adventure because they've visited these locations for real.
Yeah.
I've got a particular topic I want to discuss as well. And I mean, we're still pretty much in the car chase at the moment, but I want to talk about the Bond song.
Yes.
And I'm going to put my opinion out there at the moment. This is one of the lesser Bond songs for me. And it certainly is for a lot of people. But I wouldn't call it the worst. It's just simply unmemorable. I really like the... The
riff is great.
It's really dirty. It sounds cool. I really like that part. But the actual bulk of the song is really forgettable. My issue is the visuals.
Oh, yeah.
And it feels really at odds with the rest of the entirety of the Bond series. And I know that they did change.
This was another part of the new broom, which was rectified in the next film.
Yeah, MK12 was brought in.
MK12, yeah.
For the title sequence. But it really feels at odds with the rest of Bond's canon. And it, again, feels like another moment following from Casino Royale, where I don't know why they're making that statement that was something completely different when essentially you're making an epilogue to that film.
Yeah, and also because that Casino Royale title sequence was so well received at the time, it's still it's probably in the top 5 of all Bond title sequences.
I think the song as well, the title sequence improves that song, because I remember when that song, Chris Cornell song, came out, people thought it's a little bit cheesy, but then when you saw it with the visuals that were presented, it works. That's one of my favourite title sequences as well.
Again, this is like this new broom that Mark Forster brought in, where he had his own people on the film, and he'd worked with MK12 before, and they're also responsible for all the other sort of graphics in the film, including the Minority Report screens and stuff like that.
Oh, are they?
Yeah. The established titles designer, Daniel Kleinman, was absent from this film. Again, he returned for the next film and has continued onwards and is still doing them. So this is like, again, it feels like a really odd one-out film.
Yeah.
Like there's so many people missing from the process that usually are here. I mean, I quite like the song for what it is. I think the riff is good. I like the way it's been recorded. Like, you can tell it's a proper analog recording. I like the drumming on it.
Yeah.
And even like the brass is quite cool.
I was about to say, I really like the brass. I like the instrumental side of it. And it's not so much that I don't like what Alicia Keys and Jack White are bringing to the table. It's just that it's not made an impact on me. But it's not a song that offends me listening to it.
I think that's where it falls down, is Alicia Keys and just the lyrics. The lyrics are fucking atrocious.
They are. Yeah.
And I think also it's made worse by Alicia Keys because she has some fucking awful ad-libs that she does in the, like, the bang, 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 bang. It's like, that's fucking horrendous.
You get a sense that they're just jamming.
Yeah, it's not quite as bad as Sigmund Freud analyze this from Die Another Day. I mean, Die Another Day, I think, is still the worst Bond theme and will remain so. I mean, I think Sam Smith gave it a run for its money.
I do.
But it's still number one for me.
I think if you're looking at objectively bad, then yes. But I think if we go down the road as to what entertained me most now.
Yeah, I'm very mixed on the recent Bond themes anyway, because I think the one thing I liked about the first two Daniel Craig themes is that they were very up-tempo and very rocky and sort of kind of more masculine, whereas I feel when you start getting into like the writings on the wall and it's like that's not what Bond should be. I mean, Bond needs to be kind of big and ballsy. It's a bit too much like feelings.
I think Skyfall's the one that works.
Skyfall's okay, yeah.
I like Skyfall. I think it works for the type of film that they're making as well.
Yeah, I think Skyfall's a little bit overrated, but I don't mind it. I think it's okay. I think another positive for me, putting the theme song aside, I do genuinely really like the score for this one.
The score's fantastic. I love it.
And I think it's a real shame that David Arnold has not been given the opportunity to do another Bond score, because I thought at this point he was fucking nailing it.
Yeah.
It's probably my second favourite Bond score of his after Casino.
Yeah.
I like his Tomorrow Never Dies score. Not so keen on his World Is Not Enough score. It's a bit too electronic in 90s.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Die Another Day is not too bad, actually. But I feel with the Craig films, because he was
in his element.
He was given the task of not using the Bond theme so much and being a lot more overtly classical and everything and being a bit more naturalistic. He was just fucking nailing it at that point. And those two Craig scores that he did out are really good.
Casino Royale is a 5 out of 5 score for me. I really love that score. I remember listening to it before I saw the film and just knocked me out. But I haven't really listened to the Quantum of Solace score outside of the film, but when I watched it the other day, I was like, oh my God, I forgot how good this music was. And I put it on straight after having seen the film as well. And it is a great score. David Arnold's a weird composer as well, in terms of, like, I don't think he gets the credit he deserves. And he's always been approached as more like a workman, like somebody who doesn't have a sound. But I think if you actually look at his work, you can hear it. And with these Bond films as well, especially when you look at Casino and Quantum, they have a distinctive feel.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that he's never really been given the credit for his work on these films. And also that there isn't enough, like, clamour for him to return. Why aren't people asking, like, rather than looking at these films and saying, oh, I would love to see a Bond film with Hans Zimmer score, which we're going to get, or, like, you know, a John Williams Bond film or that kind of thing. Why not ask for David Arnold? Why isn't there enough people, like, building hype for another David Arnold return?
I think a lot of the hardcore fans always want David Arnold to come back. I don't know whether there's some kind of bad blood between David Arnold in Eon now? I don't think there is, because he was involved in the rhythm section. I don't know what it is regarding him not coming back to score any more films. But some of the cues that David Arnold does on this score are so good. I mean, the Night at the Opera one is a real highlight. So much so that Hans Zimmer completely ripped it off for Inception.
Yeah. And one thing I will say as well about David Arnold, and I mean this in general, not just for Bond films, why isn't there any fanfare about him scoring films in general? Because he is a real good composer. He's one that I really appreciate, but there's never really any buzz around him composing a film. But I look forward to a David Arnold score. And I'll say one film that really benefits from his work, and considering it was such a small job for him as well, because he only got to work on a film for just a limited number of, it was like a week or something. But Hot Fuzz.
Hot Fuzz
has a fantastic David Arnold score. And he only did a few tracks, but my God, does he give that film so much personality.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about him. He's versatile as well. He can do big action, but he can do comedy, and he can make it irreverent as well, but also still packs a punch. Yeah, I don't know. There's always been a big question mark over David Arnold for me about what's happened there.
Yeah. I think the other thing I want to talk about in terms of this being a sequel to Casino and kind of flubbing it and wasting it, because obviously we've talked about how the story doesn't really connect, but I think the other big thing is how it takes some characters that were established very well in Casino and completely waste them, and doesn't give anybody coming in afterwards an opportunity to pick it up and do something else with it. And I'm specifically talking about the character of Rene Mathis, played by Giancarlo Giannini, who is easily one of the best Bond side characters ever, and is completely wasted and done away with in this film in such an unceremonious way. And I just thought, God, he could have been in so many other films cropping up here and now and again.
Yeah.
He's such a great character, and I don't understand why they decided that they would kill him off in this film.
And there could have been this prickly tension the whole time because of the false imprisonment of the character due to Bond incriminating him.
Yeah, because he's such a fantastic and endearing character and just a great actor.
He really is. It's weird that this season of Popcorn Digest is stringed together by Giancarlo Giannini films and facts.
Yeah, it really is. For the most random stuff as well, toys. But yeah, it was such a great presence in Casino. I mean, he completely lights up the second half of that film.
Yeah.
I mean, they've attempted that kind of character in the past. I mean, I know he's actually a genuine Ian Fleming character because he's in the book of Casino. And throughout the whole Bond series, they've tried to replicate Karen Bay or have a Karen Bay style character in the film. They've attempted it numerous times. I think the only time before that they really got it right was Topol in For Your Eyes Only.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think was a very good version of that character. Yeah. But I think this was the first time since Topol that they'd had a character like that genuinely worked.
Yeah.
And what they do with him in this film, his appearance is so brief. I mean, I think he's in and out of the film within 10 minutes.
10 minutes, easily,
and the way that they kill him off and what they do with that character is just awful. It's such a shame.
I mean, to go back to what we were talking about, to go back to our Star Wars episode, we were talking about The Last Jedi in terms of it completely doing away with arcs that The Force Awakens does set up and that type of thing. But I would say that, at least with that film, they're doing that in a way to service the story that they're telling. With Quantum of Solace, it seems to be so intent on undoing what Casino Royale did, but it's adding nothing of its own in the process.
No.
It's not in service of a greater story or anything like that or something further. It's just an undoing and nothing more. And that's a big issue for me with that particular character, because I really like Giancarlo Giannini as well.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, he's effortlessly endearing. He does light up the film, but yeah, for his end to come with a discarding of his body in a dumpster, it's such a unceremonious end for a potentially could have been all-timer Bond side character.
Yeah, huge oversight in the series in general that they lost that character.
Okay, so one of the things that I do actually want to speak about in regards to the film, and this is like a mainstay of every Bond film has this, including the one that doesn't apparently, which is Skyfall, but every film has a Bond girl.
Or Bond lady.
Or Bond lady. Yes, we've Can't call them girls anymore.
No.
But yes, every film has a Bond girl, obviously, and this one is played by Olga Kurylenko. I've actually forgot her name. Oh, Camille, that's it, isn't it? I just wanted to talk about this for a while as well, because I think it was an impossible task to set up a Bond girl for Quantum of Solace following the absolutely stellar chemistry and character interaction that Casino Royale has between James Bond and Vesper. I mean, that's actually become something of a classic of the genre now. So I think it really made an impact. And I will say one of the things I'm actually grateful for with this film in particular is that they presented a Bond girl that was never framed as a potential for that type of interaction or a replacement for that. And although Olga Kurylenko is obviously a model-esque, very pretty individual, somebody who you would expect to play a Bond girl type role, the film never really frames her as a sexual object in Bond's eyes.
No.
And I think that was definitely the right choice to make for having that type of character. If you do have to have a Bond girl, and my question is whether or not that was needed or not is another question entirely. But if you are still playing with those elements, I'm at least thankful that they didn't try and just recreate what Casino Royale did and try and push in another love object or lust object.
Yeah.
I say that, but I'm going to take it away with my next statement. That Strawberry Fields is one of the worst Bond girls for me.
Yeah.
I like Gemma Arterton. I think she's fine. But I would be pissed, really. She's come out and said that came at a point in her career when she wasn't as confident. And if that had come to her now, she would have turned the role down for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's a severely underwritten role, and there's very little for her to do in the story. And I was thinking about this before because I think this is something that will crop up when we start talking about some of the subplots that were abandoned and things like that. The film, because it's very unfinished in its screenplay, seems to have many moments that should be on screen which are left out, like key moments. And one of those moments is to do with Agent Fields, because she just disappears from the movie for quite a large chunk, and then the next time we see her, she's been gold-fingered. So...
Yeah. Oh my gosh. The poor girl.
Yeah. And it's just, it feels very throwaway and flimsy.
I feel like she's only there, and I use it in this phrase because this is the kind of respect that it's dealt with. But she's used in such a way that the producers or somebody along the line just went, well, Bond needs to shag somebody. And that's it. That's all she's there really to occupy. Even thinking at the time, I remember when Gemma Arterton was cast in this, and I thought, oh, great. Not that she's a particular actress that I follow or anything like that, but I thought she wasn't like a no-name or anything like that. And I was shocked when I saw the film how little she was actually used.
There is a term that Bond fans use for those kind of characters, which is sacrificial lamb. And I think she is the sacrificial lamb of this film. Even though you have Mathis, because he's a continuation character, it doesn't fall into that category. Sacrificial lamb characters are those kind of characters that just crop up to be killed at some point, and they have very little going on themselves.
Because it's a sacrificial lamb character to just illustrate that bad guys are bad at a point in the film which we do not need. We don't need that statement anymore. We already understand they're bad, because it happens in like the last half hour of the film where suddenly she turns up and she's been gold-fingered.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, we're in the last half hour of the film. We already know the bad guys are bad. We don't need this statement to hammer that home.
Yeah.
I mean, these are the type of things as well that, given a normal production schedule, a normal time for development, these are the kinds of things that are always hashed out for scripts early doors.
Yeah, she's just been penciled in. She's very much like a placeholder. I mean, the whole film is a placeholder because it's had to be dealt with like that because they've had no time to go any deeper into it. So I think also what I want to talk about as well in terms of Camille, her inclusion in the story is very contrived at times.
It is.
The way she appears and disappears and then reappears.
She's like a script convenience. She's there for the script writer to help them out whenever needed.
Yeah. The worst one is her very first appearance, the fact that Bond exits the hotel after killing that Slate character, and she just happens to be driving by at that exact moment. and recognizes him for whatever reason. Like,
it's all coincidence as well that
yeah,
he killed that guy. Even if it was a planned thing for her to
Yeah.
turn up and pick up this particular guy, even for Bond to turn up and kill that guy at the moment she was supposed to be, it's all rather. Well, that's one of the things I was going to say. I like the type of Bond girl that she's positioned as in this film, but I still feel like there are major character issues, and I still have certain question marks with this film, just in regards to it having a Bond girl at all, because of the shadow that Vesper has over this film as well. And that's part of the issue for me as well. I keep on saying it, but if you are going to make this type of film that is an immediate follow-up to Casino Royale, dealing with the immediate aftermath, then it has to be explicitly about Vesper, or at least like thematically about Vesper. I don't understand what Bond has gained or learned during his journey through this film that's helped him deal with or overcome any issue that he had with Vesper's death. I don't understand what that arc is.
No. It's like they ran out of time to explore that. It's very apparent when you get the moment when Bond leaves Dominic Green in the desert and he says, "Oh, I told you all you needed to know about Quantum." What are those things?
Yeah.
It's like they've cut all the good bits out. And then moments later, you've got the scene with Yusuf Kabira in Russia, and it just fades out at the crucial moment.
Yeah.
You've just faded out on like a potentially great scene. The whole thing just feels like there's no bit for this. We'll move on to the next section.
And like, when was the film ever about him coming to the understanding that this revenge isn't going to give him peace? When is that ever hammered home? Because I don't understand at that point in the film what he's learned in Quantum of Solace that means that he doesn't pull the trigger at the end.
No.
Because the Bond at the end of that film, in my eyes, would still pull the trigger. Moments ago with Camille, he was prepping her for killing her long-time target. And there's nothing in that suddenly he comes to revelation of, oh, what have I done to this poor girl, or anything like that. She gets what she needs.
Yeah.
Why doesn't Bond pull the trigger at the end? And even if you had set the film up as being this question mark about whether or not what he would do in this particular moment, why not dwell on that further and see the internal struggle of the character?
Yeah.
Why, as you mentioned, cut away at the most interesting point of the conversation? But I understand the situation, and I understand the writer's strike has really hobbled them in this regard, and also the 18-month production period. But I still feel like even on a rewrite, a writer like Paul Haggis would see the issue with that. However, I did read that Paul Haggis had a completely different ending in mind for what the coda would be. And reading it, I was actually thinking it's a little bit more cliche, but it makes more sense.
Yeah. I mean, reading about the initial drafts and the ideas that got cut out, it feels like they've left some of all the juicy stuff on the floor.
Yeah.
And all you've got is this bare bones structure with all the actual context taken out. It does read like a second draft of something, because you've just got the bare bones of something, taking, your character from A to B as quickly as possible, and then you'll go in on your next pass and fill in those details. I mean, to be honest, the crucial mistake that they made was with the initial Purvis and Wade script that they had, they were taking the things that they thought were important at the end of Casino.
Yeah.
And for some reason, they decided to throw that away. I mean, to be honest, you can probably blame Roger Michel, because he's the one that kind of bailed and came up with this alternate idea. And I think everyone after that point was probably unsure what they wanted to do.
Yeah, I think coming in as well and putting doubt in the mind of the original script, and then jumping ship immediately afterwards. He's essentially just jumps on board and went, well, the script shit, see ya.
Yeah.
And that is from the opinion of somebody that isn't much of a Bond fan, that isn't even an action film director or that type of thing. So I feel like he's come in, destabilised the ship in that regard, and then done one.
Yeah.
Reading Some Kind of Hero and what Purvis and Wade did have, it seems like the two elements that did survive were the opening car chase and everything that's surrounding that, really. The opening conversation with Mr. White, and then the opera scene was originally supposed to be the coda for their script, which, fantastic. That sounds like it would have been a great little tease to set up Quantum for the future.
Yeah, because I would say where it is in the movie now, the opera scene is kind of in the wrong place.
Yeah.
Also in the way that it deals with Mr. White. Like, Mr. White, obviously they cut that original ending out, which we'll probably need to talk about in a minute, but he just disappears in the middle of the film. Because he's so sort of heavily advertised in Casino, I think the film should have been dealing with Mr. White much more heavily.
Yeah.
And it seemed to be that way, obviously, when you read the original version of the story, that there's more meat to that, a much more organic connection between the two films if you're going to have that. Because, everything just feels so, like, wasted because of this lack of development time.
And the quantum thing as well, like, speaking about that particular, the opera scene, that is my favourite scene in the film. It's, to be honest, anybody you speak to about this film, they always say the opera scene is the best scene in the film. So where suddenly it comes alive a little bit. But I would say that it sets up a second half to the film that doesn't come.
Yeah, definitely.
Because of its placement in the film, it sets it up as being this greater conspiracy that we're about to get into with all of these mysterious, shadowy characters. And it never becomes about that.
Yeah, it should have come at the end of the film and should have been recontextualized, because the only issue I have with it in its current state, with the way that they are conducting their meeting, it makes the organization seem a little bit incompetent.
Yeah.
The fact that they would have a meeting in the open air, in public, like that, I thought it would have been a better idea. One, to put it at the end, but also maybe have it so at some point Bond gains some sort of like intel or way of manipulating the organization to meet at this point.
Yeah.
Almost like set them up in a way. It would have made Bond a bit more proactive in that way of like getting all these people in one place. Something needed to happen. It doesn't, it's a waste of obviously a very expensive sequence that really doesn't add much.
No.
Especially the fact that they cut the original ending, which they didn't think was important, but I think it had a real knock-on effect to that scene, which obviously cost a lot of money and seems to set up a lot of characters that we never see again.
I think now's the time really to go into as well what the original ending was.
Yeah.
So would you like to go through that with ourselves and set the scene, Andy?
Yeah, so they had an original ending, another scene that occurs after the final scene in the finished film. Apparently it's about a minute long. It seems like there's a lot of stuff in there for a minute, but given the editing in this film, I'm not surprised. I mean, to be honest, in any normal film, it will probably be about 3 or 4 minutes, but in this film, it's a minute, so fuck it. But it seems to be in the opera scene when you get a glimpse of some of the other people in the quantum organization that obviously have other jobs, and the key one is a character called Guy Haynes, who's the special envoy to the Prime Minister, played by Paul Ritter of Friday Night Dinner. I wanted to say Bambinos or something like that and have no shirt on and sit in his pants. But the final scene that they shot was Bond finally catching up with Mr. White and killing him and then getting to Guy Haynes. And it was almost like a repeat of the end of Casino, where he sort of confronts Guy Haynes. He's sort of gone on to the next person. He's gone higher up the food chain, sort of thing. They cut the scene out because they thought, is it more about Bond's emotional journey? So is having the scene before be the last scene, is that better? Is it better to leave Mr. White more mysterious so they can use him again? Also, does it give the next director coming on board for the next movie a little bit more freedom? And I can see those viewpoints, but I think they should have actually gone back and shot something else, because I think we needed to have some sort of something with this Guy Haynes, because they seem to set him up and then he disappears and that's it. And they're never referenced again.
Even in the way that it is presented, it still frames him as somebody of importance to the narrative. Like, all the shadowy figures there, it provides enough of him to say, this is a face to remember. But it never comes back into play again.
Yeah. Especially given his position as the PM special envoy. It's like there is an actual quantum member as a mouthpiece of the government. And that's a really interesting idea. They don't do anything with it. And it's just, that's why I find this film incredibly frustrating, because there are some really good ideas, little gems of ideas that are just not followed through.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. And one of the things I did want to get into on this episode was the fact that I really was disappointed with this film when I first saw it. I was disappointed for a while, and it's one of the ones that I've revisited least. But watching it now, I would say I'm disappointed less in the film that it is, but more about the idea of what it could have been. and some of the ideas at play and how they never come full circle, especially like in the aftermath of certain other films being released in the series. I've come to view Quantum as just a bit of a misfire rather than the worst Bond ever, as it was approached for a very long time. I think because Casino Royale was such a success, I mean, it's one of my favourite top 5 Bond films.
Yeah.
But because it was such a success, I think the shortfalls of Quantum were made more apparent in light of that success. I think I've made peace with the idea of Quantum just being not particularly bad, but just not particularly good either. It's not an actively bad film. It's one that if I was reviewing it for Empire, I would still call it a disappointing 3 out of 5.
Yeah.
You know, that type of film.
Yeah, because it seemed to me that when Mark Forster took over the film, he just didn't seem to be very interested in following up the themes of Quantum. He just wanted to bring in his own themes, and they maybe should have gone then, okay, let's abandon this sequel idea and have it maybe set some time after. Maybe reference it a little bit, but then just have it be its own thing.
My only issue is that the promise of the Casino Royale's coda is that we have somewhere to go with Mr. White.
Yeah.
And so it promises in some way, shape or form a continuation of that idea. Personally, the issue is that it never decides what it wants to be, whether or not it wants to be something that particularly stands alone or something that's a sequel.
Yeah.
On the face of it, it's a sequel, but it actually does nothing with any of the ideas that it has from Casino Royale. No. And I think you're right. I think in the sense that if they had made it a standalone thing entirely, it would have helped people divorce it from Casino Royale and approach it as its own thing. But I also think that Casino Royale lives us with a place in a character where I want to see a continuation, at least on a thematic level, of the character grappling with some of the themes established in that film and where it leaves them. But I know what you mean. It's more so in just a grand story sense, like in terms of who our villain is, what our character's goal is and motivation, that type of thing. I do understand where you're coming from in that regard.
Yeah, because I feel like the character of Mr. White, and it's probably good to start talking about the villains in this film.
Yeah.
I think Mr. White, given his introduction in Casino and the potential of that character, was mishandled in both of his subsequent appearances. Yes. I didn't feel, given the actor and the potential of that character, it was really squandered. He is barely in Quantum.
Yeah.
Especially considering they cut one of his scenes.
What happened to his accent in this film?
I don't know.
He suddenly goes like very Yorkshire.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, you have no idea what you're talking about, Mr. Bond.
Yeah.
He does turn very northern for a moment during his interrogation.
That scene is so fucking fast. You know, they barely said hello.
It's practically a feather dusting, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. And yeah, this whole dealing with parallel action as well. Mark Forster seems to have this idea of paralleling action, but then forgetting to actually have them relate to one another.
I hated it. I hate it.
It seems to be a big bugbear with a lot of fans that he likes to cut away to things that have absolutely no importance to the plot or anything going on, really. It's like they haven't got enough footage and they've just cut to B-roll all the time.
Yeah, I hate it. One, it has no bearing, not even a like a symbolic meaning or anything like that. What's the horse race got to do with any of this? Also, because of the way that the film is edited, it's already quite hard to follow what's happening. But then to just throw in the odd random shot of a horse race every now and again, or people unrelated to the action screaming or enjoying themselves. It reminds me of a movie called House of the Dead by Uwe Boll, where every now and again he'll just during the action sequences of people fighting zombies, he actually cut in the odd clips of the video game as if people wouldn't know. And it reminds me of that. It takes me right out of the film.
In a way, it is like that because that paleo scene was actually shot way ahead of production. The actual full-scale shots were actually filmed, I think it's held in like September, October, and they're just inserted in there. They shot that as insurance because it was in the script. I think they felt like obliged to stick it in there, but it is not needed whatsoever because it doesn't have any kind of bearing on the action sequence, really, apart from one woman getting shot. If the sequence had involved them running in the midst of, say, the horses or something like that, it would have made more sense. But the fact that all it's there for is so they can have a crowd. It's just addressing. There's not even anything in the action that would suggest that it needs to be there.
Yeah. While we're on the topic of villains, we haven't actually spoke much about Dominic Green.
Nope.
A man after my own name. Yes, so what do you think about Dominic Green? What do you think of the actor playing Dominic Green? Matthew Almerac?
Yeah, I love Matthew Almerac, but I think he just wasn't given enough to do.
No.
I also wrote in my notes as well, he probably has the weakest villain introduction in all of the Bond films.
Yes.
There's no pomp and circumstance to his entrance.
He's literally
into the film.
stamping something in, like...
Yeah, he's just doing stamps.
Yeah.
He's just doing his stamp collection.
That's it. You disturbed me while I was looking over my antique coins. It's like if Bond walked in on Blofeld for the first time and he turns around in his chair going, I was watching Antiques Roadshow.
Yeah. Do it away.
Yeah.
In fact, that would be more effective.
Yeah. I was having a shit. I really love the actor. Like, and to be honest, to say I love the actor, I saw The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, and it kind of blew my tiny little mind and made me cry for a very long time afterwards. And even when he was announced as the cast, I was like, I wonder how they're going to do it, like in terms of the type of villain he'll be. And he's such a wimp. He's such a wussy kind of non-impact villain. And it also culminates in one of the worst mismatched Bond fistfights ever. I mean, the way that he keeps on wielding that axe as well, screaming with every lunge, is comical.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't like this character.
No.
And I feel like he was really mismatched for this role. I think he... Again, we're kind of spoilt because Mads Mikkelsen was so good in Casino Royale.
Yeah.
And you can see that in the type of actor that they've got for this role as well. They still had that type of thing in mind, but it doesn't come together whatsoever.
Yeah, I think they were attempting to do the opposite of that character, but didn't have anything to replace it with.
Yeah, who is the character? That's the issue I was going to say. How would you describe Dominic Green? All I would say is he's a wimp and a bit of a wuss and a bit of a weasel.
He's a bit slippery, that's about it, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Again, I don't think they had any time to just develop that character and, make him more idiosyncratic. I know they wanted to shy away from having any kind of physical defects or anything like that. But
yes.
I don't think that was the issue, really.
No.
Because the way that he looks anyway, I think there was something there. I didn't think it was poor casting. I just thought it was poor writing and direction rather than anything else.
I mean, I still think he's a great actor. I think if given the right role, it could have been something. But the fact that it culminates with a fist fight, like a punch up on a balcony, essentially in a burning hotel, says everything that's wrong with that character because they didn't know what to do with him. I really like the way that he exits the film with the gasoline moment. Here you go, drink the motor oil. That's a really effective bit. But the fact that I can't imagine Blofeld. Blofeld isn't intimidating because of his physical presence, nor is any director or writer going to set it up that by the end of this film, it's going to come down to Sean Connery beating a man with a pussycat. It's...
Yeah.
That's not what it's going to be about. The fact that they do that with Dominic Green tells me that they just didn't know what to do with this character.
No. Although I do like the axe and the foot gag. That's I've always liked that. It's
a really good moment.
Yeah,
exactly. Because
the best part of that whole fight, really.
Yeah, it's a moment that makes you go, fuck.
Yeah. Fucking hell.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's all there is to it, really. There's no other great moments.
When you're talking about a man getting an axe wound to the to the foot as like the film's pinnacle, it's peak.
Yeah. And everything's very stock as well. Like that General Medrano character, again, I think it's the casting is fine. It's just they had this South American general. That's it. They just wrote in the script, South American general is a bit of a bastard. Okay, we'll have him be a rapist. His character's just like a few bullet points and they forgot to do anything else with that character. It's like...
He's so stock, I'm surprised his name wasn't even like as obvious as General Contaro or something.
Yeah.
General Bastardo.
General Bastardo. Oh, God. His placing in the film as well, like in terms of how it parallels with Camille's story, I'm not sure his introduction into the film is right either. I think we should have maybe heard more about him before we saw him, build him up a little bit more.
Yes, especially with the backstory that they have together with that character. We essentially are greeted to him while he's like on holiday on a dock or something. Like, just coming to the dock to meet my mate to talk about.
He's rocking his Hawaiian shirt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's nothing intimidating whatsoever. That's my issue with this film, is that there's nothing intimidating about these characters.
Yeah.
And I don't mean in just a physical sense, but in an emotional or intellectual sense either. There's nothing about them that's intimidating, or the way that they're presented. They're just,
no,
as you mentioned, they're just stock.
Yeah. It just doesn't work. It's just a bit wet.
Yeah.
And yeah, they have very little impact in the film, and trying not to mention Spectre too much, but when they try and tie all that together, they downplay their involvement in Spectre. Because I think they obviously recognise that how ineffectual those villains were.
Yeah, it comes down to like a picture.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. So much so, like, I think one of the most effective villains, and he's not in the film enough. And
Elvis.
No, we probably should mention him more, because he's probably much more recognised these days, is David Harbour.
Yeah, he's great in this as well. I really like his kind of slippery Americanness.
I think that character could have been great, but he's just not in the film enough. And I think it would have been great to have explored that a bit more. Because he's not in the film enough, there's not enough Jeffrey Wright as Felix Leiter in this film. Like,
and again, he's great again. Every time that he and Bond are on screen together, you can see that they've got such great chemistry. And they're not even together long enough.
That interaction in the bar as well. How long have I got? 30 seconds. Why? Why have we got 30 seconds? We've only got 30 seconds because there's no fucking scene. Like, you haven't written it.
It's like they're both on passing trains, and they've got to just deliver the dialogue just as the trains pass each other. It's like...
It's like they do the opposite of what a lot of people do, because some films suffer because their scenes are overlong and they outstay their welcome, but this has the opposite effect where nothing is long enough. Yeah. Nothing has time to...
Are you unsatisfied?
Oh, yeah.
It's not got the depth or the reach that you would enjoy.
Yeah, Quantum of Solace is a chode. Yeah. Quantum of Solace is a chode, and Spectre's the long pencil dick.
Yeah, exactly. To be honest, these films do join the pantheon of Popcorn Digest and Best Forgotten Movies films that we have likened to different types of dicks. So we've described plenty of film as a flaccid dick. So now we have the chode film to add to the ensemble, and also the pencil dick to come. Well, hey.
Yeah. But I think that's definitely an appropriate way of describing either film. But we've got to talk about this hotel.
Definitely.
Jesus Christ.
So this hotel, I love that they introduce it like all of a sudden it rumbles to life at one point.
Yeah.
And somebody says, what was that? And he said, fuel cells. And you go, it seems rather dangerous. And it's like, nobody cares.
Pain in the ass, really.
These fuel cells are in every single fucking wall in the place. Yeah. It's like... Anywhere there's a fight, to be honest, the whole thing sets aflame because somebody crashes their car in the car park. Like, if somebody's gonna crash their car anywhere, if an accident's gonna happen in this place, it will be the car park. Maybe not put all of your fuel cells or some of them even in the car park where that can happen.
It's actually a real hotel in the Atacama Desert, which is the driest place on Earth. So if you're going to have something that's flammable, don't have it there, because it's just going to... There's nothing to suppress it at all. Oh, it's so unbelievably stupid. It's like something out of an Austin Powers film.
It really is.
I'm pretty sure they could have come up with something better to have an excuse for explosions. It lessens its impact because it's just so stupid.
Go with a bomb. Always go with a bomb. In a Bond film, go with a bomb. Bad guy, bomb. Just make some reason. There, it's done. You want a place to set aflame, that's fine. But it's like, I had a bit of a prang in the car park. Now we know 160 people are dead.
Yeah, 160 died due to bad maneuvering.
Yeah. in fender bender at hotel.
Oh dear. They should have signs up there saying "Don't sneeze" or anything like that, and "Don't raise your voice; it will set off."
Yeah, don't fart.
Yeah.
Just
don't fart.
One nasty fart.
Adding
and the whole
fuel
place
to the
goes
fire.
gone.
Yeah. It's just it's a really strange film, this, because it's not good, but I don't hate it.
Yeah, it is. I think you've just described it then to me, really. I know I said it's not particularly bad, but I haven't really got that much good to say about it, but I feel like it's just so inoffensively bad now.
Yeah.
I'm not fussed about its badness anymore. I'm just not arsed.
No.
And let's face it, there are plenty of bad Bond films, and we all get along with them fine.
Yeah.
But some are far worse than others.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, in a way, because its brevity is a big issue, but it's also something that I think lessens its negative impact some way, because it doesn't outstay its welcome. So what it's presenting isn't the most brilliant thing in the world, but because it is so short, it's like...
It's inconsequential.
Yeah, I didn't waste like that much of my life on it.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
It's fine.
I mean, other than, obviously, we mentioned Mathis, there are no real big swings in this film.
No.
Nobody takes a swing for something. It is an inconsequentially bad film. So you just kind of, like you mentioned, you just reason with yourself. It's disappointing, but it's fine. It's just one of them.
And it's a shame, because it is, it's a waste of a potentially good follow-up to a great film. And
there are interesting ideas as well at play around the film.
Yeah.
And around the making of the film. It's just that in the rush to get something out there, they've cut a lot of the flesh from the bone.
Yeah, and they've just fumbled it. And yeah, that's really all I can say about it, because...
Went a bit Forrest Gump there, and that's all I have to say about it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure there's other things in this, but it is so ineffectual that I can't be too angry about it.
Yeah,
So it's like that, really.
Okay, so moving over to the part of the episode where we do discuss the stats and facts surrounding this movie. So we're going to be discussing the box office, the critical reception, and the audience reception as well to the film. So starting with the box office, I'm going to go over some figures, but I've also brought up some figures from Casino Royale so we can make a closer reference to a film of its type.
Mm-hmm.
So Quantum of Solace was made with a budget of $200 million, which was, I mean, I know this is only 12 years ago, but still, that's quite a significant amount of money for then. And
yeah,
I mean, it's still a significant amount of money now, but it's more so back then. And it was a big increase over Casino Royale's budget of $150 million as well.
Yeah.
So that's what we're dealing with here. So this film opened to $68 million US opening, and it made $168 million US total, and to a worldwide gross of $590 million, which, when you actually look at the figures for Casino Royale, it is a decline on that film, but only by a marginal amount. Casino Royale opened to $41 million, which is less, but still made domestically $167 million. When you actually look at the two figures, they're almost identical.
Yeah.
And the worldwide gross was $616 million. So only an increase of about $26 million over Quantum. However, when you have a film like Casino Royale that is such a big hit with the fans, that does make the money, you expect the next film to go on and make more. Because I think what Casino Royale did really effectively was it re-established Bond as a contender on the US market as well.
Yeah.
In a big way, because it had such a big response. And they had the potential to taking it that next step in almost like what Skyfall did kind of way. But obviously they fumbled it essentially.
Yeah.
And it didn't have, if you look at the figures, it didn't have the lasting power. Because although they made very similar in terms of money, Quantum of Solace opened stronger and still came out making about the same.
Yeah. I think it had less rewatch value and word of mouth and everything like that. Its budget was considerably higher, and I think even its marketing push might have been more at the time. I do remember the marketing for Quantum being slightly heavier than Casino. Yeah, so even though it's making just under, it's obviously making quite a bit less than Casino because there was a big of investment there, I think.
Yeah.
And also the fact that it's a much shorter film, therefore it should probably have at least one more screening a day.
Exactly,
so, you've got that to factor into it as well. So it's probably a bit of a setback, to be honest.
To look at the films that it was competing with at the time as well, it isn't really a particularly strong week for releases, and for the time of year, it should have really been mopping up that market.
Yeah.
This is going by the US market, obviously. So Quantum opened at number 1. Number 2 was Madagascar, I think, one of the sequels, 2 or 3 or something
Might
like
have been
that.
2, I think.
Yeah, I think it was. Number 3 was Role Models. Number 4 was High School Musical 3.
That was the only one they released at the cinema, wasn't it?
It was, yes. Yeah, that's right. Are you a High School Musical fan, Andy?
Nope.
And number 5 was Clint Eastwood's Changeling. And number 6 was Zack and Miri Make a Porno. Number 7 was Soul Men. Number 8 was The Secret Life of Bees. Number 9 was Saw 5. And number 10 was the classic Beverly Hills Chihuahua.
That's a really low-key week,
Yes,
isn't it?
that is very low-key. That says everything about that time of year for releasing films.
Yeah.
Yeah, moving over to the critical reception for Quantum of Solace. Rotten Tomatoes has this film at a 65% fresh rating with 6.16, so a 6.16 out of 10 average rating from the critics. And the consensus is, brutal and breathless, Quantum of Solace delivers tender emotions along with frenetic action. But coming on the heels of Casino Royale, the dirty get,
Coming on there.
it's still a bit of a disappointment. Who does he think he is? Quentin Tarantino?
Yeah.
Coming on the heels. Okay. So, I mean, that's far more positive than I thought it was going to be looking up this film today.
But it's still a big drop-off from
Huge.
Casino. Yeah.
Casino's still like 92 or 93%, if not more.
I think it's 94, actually.
Whew, there we go.
Yeah, so I think critically it was a big setback.
Yeah.
I mean, you're almost back into Pierce Brosnan territory with those kind of ratings.
Yes, definitely. And given that I knew today's conversation was going to be one that dealt with many negatives, I thought to bring up a review from a positive review, essentially from a critic, Kim Newman, who we've covered on this podcast before.
Yeah.
And he does say, a pacey, visually imaginative follow-up to the series relaunch. If it doesn't even try to be bigger and better than Casino Royale, that's perhaps a smart move in that there's still a sense at the finish that Bond's mission has barely begun and he'll need a few more movies to work his way up to demolishing the apparently undefeatable Quantum organization. Man, that sentence is a nightmare to get through. It just keeps going and going like a Duracell battery. As with The Dark Knight, the only real caveat is that while it's exciting and imaginative, it's not exactly anyone's idea of fun. To keep in the game, perhaps the next movie, the Hildebrand rarity, the property of a lady, could let the hero enjoy himself a little bit more. And that, as mentioned, was from Kim Newman, and he did give the film 4 out of 5. For a film that he didn't think was any fun.
Yeah, that's kind of a very odd 4 out of 5. It's definitely falls in the middle somewhere, really, this film, because it's strange, because really it should be rated lower,
Much
but I
lower?
just can't
Yeah.
bring myself to do it, because it's not doing anything that's, like, so fucking terrible that...
I mean, if certain films hadn't been released since, I would be far more negative on this film. I think I would be far more negative on this film as I was before. I would easily say, it's a much worse film. But because Spectre's essentially been released, and I'm dancing around the idea of talking about it, but because Spectre's been released, I'm a lot more forgiving about it now.
I'm much more mellow, like, with this film.
Exactly, yeah. And the audience score for this film on Rotten Tomatoes is 58%, with a 3.39 average rating. That's 3.39 out of 5. And the IMDb score is 6.6 out of 10, which is quite a low score for a Bond film. Okay, Andy, so do you have any thoughts about Quantum of Solace? Anything to wrap this up with ourselves today? I mean, we could realistically talk forever about Bond.
I think this film proved, and it's been exacerbated because of certain outside events and things. I think it proved to the Bond crew, because I do remember them commenting on this at the time, that the next film would not follow in 2 years' time. It would be at least 3 years' time. I think it proved to the Bond team that they actually probably needed a bit more time between films at this point. Bond fans seem to complain about this a lot, that they're not getting films every 2 years. But I do know that even when they started doing that again for Pierce Brosnan, they were really struggling to keep that time frame. I just don't think, especially now, because the films have gotten so much bigger and more complicated, trying to make a Bond film every 2 years is just not practical. And I think then they realised that every 3 years was probably a better way to go. And if it wasn't for MGM going bust and all the other outside issues, we would have probably got Skyfall the year before. It's probably the biggest lasting legacy of this film, that it kind of proved that they did need more time in between films.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, for like my final wrap up on Quantum as well, I think I'd just reiterate the fact that it's not a good film, but it's one that I've
made my peace with it.
Yeah, exactly. I've made my peace with it, and it's just so inconsequential that it's just another blip on the Bond marathon that we get through. And when we do view the films as part of the Bond marathon, which, to be honest, I can't wait to do again, I am thankful for Quantum of Solace's zippy runtime. because it means there's an hour less, essentially, that I have to spend at the death. And that's all we have time for this week's episode of Popcorn Digest. I do need to say that there is nothing coming next week. This is the end of this season of Popcorn Digest. But do not fear, intrepid listener, we will be back next year. However, we may be releasing some Christmas specials over the holiday period. But until then, thank you for listening and goodbye.
Bye-bye.